Senator Van, you have the call.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms Adams and everyone, thank you for appearing today. Forgive my voice. Ms Adams, before or since the COVID restrictions, are Australians required to have an authorisation to leave Australia?
Before or
after COVID?
Before
restrictions that applied during COVID.
So apart from that period where you're
apart from that period.
I see.
But currently, do we need an authorisation to leave Australia?
Not to my recollection.
Okay.
I mean, we provide advice on Smart Traveller, which includes do not travel.
Sure.
As you know. And there may be people whose particular circumstances require them to get authorisation because, you know, state or federal authorities have required them to remain in the country.
Sure.
But you mean more generally?
And more generally. And do not travel doesn't mean cannot travel.
No, you can ignore the advice if you wish.
Thank you. After a briefing with your department with the, I think it was the full committee last week, and I tabled this piece, there was a piece from The Australian saying Victorian Liberal Senator David Van's non-authorised trip to Ukraine paid for drone maker. Did your office have any contact with the journalist on that piece?
I don't think I read that piece. I'm sorry, Senator Van.
I'm happy to table it, as I said.
Sure.
Did either the department or your office have any contact with the journalist? Thank you.
Well, I'll speak for the department and say no.
Thank you. At that last meeting, I raised a point to one of your staff, and was reiterated yesterday in the exact same words by the Secretary of the Defence Department, that Australia has provided Ukraine with approximately $655 million in support, including $475 million in military assistance. As I put to you at that briefing and to the Defence Secretary yesterday, that number's not correct, is it?
I think the number is correct. What you don't like is the verb, and I think I thought Mr. Moriarty explained that to you. I appreciate you have a different view, but if the question is how much, I mean, we are responsible for the humanitarian component, so maybe Ms. Chan or Mr. Cannon can talk about what on that side has actually been received. I think is where that funding is.
I want to.
Perhaps we just let, if I could ask them, because that's what you're asking.
No, that's not what I'm asking. You're trying to put questions in my mouth. Sorry, Minister, but.
Well, what is your question then?
So the question is, in the briefing last week, the number of $475 million of military aid has been provided.
Yeah,
and I questioned that.
Yeah, and my response is you're questioning the verb, not the amount. So I'm offering to ask officials, because your point yesterday was the verb provided is incorrect because it hasn't actually been provided, it's just been allocated. So rather than getting into a semantic argument, I thought what might be helpful is for officials to tell you in relation to the component that we are responsible for, where that humanitarian assistance
If they could take that on notice, that'd be helpful, just for time management. That'd be very helpful, thank you.
So you don't want to know?
No, I do. As I just said, I'd like to have that
We'll do it quickly.
on notice.
Can we just do it quickly?
If you can do it very quickly, but I'm going to be limited on the call, so I'd prefer it on notice.
We could have done it in the time frame we've done this.
Well, you keep arguing with me rather than...
I'm just trying to be helpful, and I anticipated the question. So we would have cut it
Minister,
short.
is your department going to take it on notice?
Sure, we'll take it on notice if you really want us to.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to lessen paperwork.
Senator Van, you have the call.
Thank you. At the last estimates, I was asking questions about why our ambassador to Ukraine hasn't been relocated from Warsaw back into Kyiv. And the answer I got on notice was that we have specific work health and safety obligations. I've worked through the Work Health and Safety Act since that time, and I can't find anything that knocks out that particular action, given the external territories, etc. On notice, can you lay out specifically what clauses of that piece of legislation mean that our ambassador cannot be back in Kyiv?
Senator Van, it won't be that sort of analysis. The overall risk assessment that I've made hasn't changed since my last testimony. The security situation in Ukraine and Kyiv in particular remains complex, challenging. It hasn't improved. As recently as last week, Russian missiles again targeted Kyiv, with Ukrainians once more forced to seek refuge in makeshift shelters, including subway stations. You also know well that civilian infrastructure is being targeted, and people, not just Ukrainians, living in Kyiv are under the threat of missiles and drone attacks. So in that context, the assessment processes, in accordance with Australian standards, remain.
I'd still like you to outline against the legislation what bits preclude you from sending him back. That's a reasonable question, I notice.
It's my risk assessment, Senator. It's not a particular provision of legislation.
So where are you taking your risk assessments from?
Under my workplace health and safety obligations.
According to the legislation?
As a risk assessment.
So where are you getting your risk assessments from? What's informing your risk assessments?
They're my risk assessments that will be internal to my workings. They will involve security assessments as well as information from defence and other
questions
agencies.
at last estimates, you said you were taking assessments from like-minded countries.
I said that was
correct?
one, we watched like-minded countries, but I also said very clearly then, and I repeat, that we operate under Australian law and under our own procedures and risk assessments.
So this is a unilateral decision you're making?
Well, of course,
not
it's
against the
Australian.
legislation?
It's my sovereign decision-making, that's
Secretary
correct.
of the department, that's her job.
So have you taken risk assessments from countries like the UK and US?
I leave them make their own decisions. They're NATO countries. They're in a different situation to us. We make our own
Canada, another
decisions,
like-minded
but
company?
of course we keep under review and we monitor what others are doing. But as I repeat, the security situation in Ukraine and Kyiv in particular has not improved since we were last here at estimates.
We might disagree on that. But Canada, whom we share a building with, has its embassy back in that same building that ours should be back in, doesn't it?
Canada's a NATO member. It makes its own decisions, as do we.
Thank you. On a question on notice, you said the department has do not travel warnings for Russia, Somalia, Mali, Burkina Faso, North Korea, Chad, Syria, Iran, Yemen, Belarus, Venezuela, Iraq, Libya, Myanmar, Central African Republic and South Sudan. In your answer, you said that the department has overseas missions with staff stationed in Russia, Iran, Iraq and Myanmar. How do they not have the same level of protection that you're trying to apply to the embassy in Kyiv? So is it okay for one to be at risk but not another?
I don't think many cities are under current drone and missile strike attack.
I think that the situation in Myanmar might be a little bit different. I would suggest the situation in Iran is definitely dangerous at the moment. I would also suggest that there are attacks in Russia going on all the time. Do these not form part of your assessments?
Well, Senator Van, of course there is. You don't do an assessment, this is just as dangerous. In every country, Ms Adams has to satisfy herself, DFAT has to satisfy themselves that it is, responsible to continue our presence there and how we mitigate risk. And, you know, I won't talk about it publicly, but in some of the areas you identify, you know, we seek to mitigate risk. But Ms Adams has...
Sorry, Minister, you finish.
Well, I don't think it's an accurate way of dealing with risk to plonk a few other tough areas of the world on the table and say, well, if you're here, you know, you should be there. I mean, each location, each post, we have to be satisfied, the department has to be satisfied that we are appropriately mitigating risk for Australians.
And you're suggesting...
posted there, and Ms Adams has made the assessment she has made.
Sorry, and Ms Adams, have you made the assessment that there is no risk mitigation you can do in Kyiv?
No, I haven't made an assessment that there's no mitigation.
Have you turned your mind to risk mitigation?
Of course.
After all, you know, we've had embassies in Afghanistan during wartime and many other places where our soldiers have been at war. So clearly risk mitigation is an option.
Yes, Baghdad included.
Yeah. And so you won't risk mitigate Kyiv, but you will the others.
Well, we're operating our embassy out of Poland. We're doing so very satisfactorily.
Satisfactory to who?
We are working with partners in a very effective way. So my assessment stands.
I think you really need to look at that reassessment, but thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, David Van. Now, before I move on to the next witness, given that you have sought to table this document, which is publicly available, but I just need to get accepted from the committee that we're happy to receive the article.
So this is the article with the headline, Victorian Liberal Senator David Van's non-authorised trip to Ukraine paid for by drone maker. That's the one
article
you want to table.
Sure.
Was paid for by a drone maker.
As it per on my register, Senator?
Yeah, well, that's
sorry.
been
There you go.
accepted. I'll now hand